Almost everything that I've deeply believed since I was an infant is either deeply wrong or only a crude approximation. It's really a shock to the system. And they apparently are living in a color world that you and I can't even imagine. Right? If I ask you, imagine a color that you've never seen before. Maybe what intelligence really is transcends the computable functions. Maybe it goes even deeper than the uncountable infinity Aleph 1. There are higher infinities, Aleph 2, Aleph 3. The question is, what is the probability that evolution by natural selection would shape our senses, vision, touch, hearing, taste, smell, to tell us truths about objective reality, whatever objective reality might be? The answer is the probability is zero. The first thing to know about science is every theory in science has assumptions at the foundation, which are miracles for that theory, and cannot be removed. So there is no theory of everything.
Dr. Donald Hoffman is a famous cognitive psychologist whose book The Case Against Reality sent shockwaves through the scientific community, arguing that the world is nothing like the one we experience through our senses. The book is fascinating but is also complex, and that is why I invited Dr. Hoffman to the accent, to explain it to me like I'm 5. Our discussion only scratched the surface of his message, but we explored many fascinating concepts I haven't heard him sharing anywhere else. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe and let's continue building this community together. You've been researching AI way before it became this mainstream, way before personal computers entered most of the homes in the United States, right? When you look at ChatGPT, what's your take?
It's a big step forward for AI, I think, but it's by no means yet anywhere close to the Holy Grail, and nowhere close. It's great for creating boilerplate, but it's not terribly creative, in my view. So if for those who think that ChatGPT is the end all and be all, no. We have a long way to go before we get something that's, I think, will be impressive. But not to take anything away from it, I think it's a good step forward. But it really is just a high-powered computer that does some deep statistical analysis. I wouldn't call it deeply intelligent yet. I would just say that it's great at looking for statistical regularities, and it can be more thorough in that than we can, and it can do more of that in a small amount of time than we can. And it can put together a good boilerplate, but you're not going to get Shakespeare out of it yet.
Interesting. And you said it's not far from being Holy Grail. What is Holy Grail in your definition?
Well, Holy Grail would be something that could actually come up with creative new ideas entirely on its own and surprise us with the originality of the literature that it produces and so forth, and would have original ideas that would surprise experts in the field. Now, we do get surprises, right? So in the Go game, for example, there are new moves that have come out of AI Go players that have set the master human players back on their heels. And that was, it looks to them like, something completely out of the original. That is, again, due to just incredibly strong compute power and heuristics for searching and so forth. So, and, someone might reply to me and say, well, that's all that humans do. Human intelligence and human creativity is nothing more than 86 billion neurons and trillions of synapses. I think not, but that is a conversation to be had.
As I understood, artificial intelligence now, it's just it doesn't have that creativity. It's just able to compute limited number of choices. Let's say in a game of chess, right? There's only a limited number of moves you can make.
That's right. In that case, it's able to do a deeper search through the search space of possible moves. In the case of ChatGPT, it's able to take a huge mass of data and find statistical regularities that allow it to predict, given a sequence of words, what would be a natural next word in human discourse for that. That's why I say it's really great for creating boilerplate, because it creates stuff that sounds fine. It's not terribly original, and if it happens to be original now and then, it will be because it stumbled onto something that it just found through statistical searching. So that's very, very different I would think, from true creativity. But again, that's a really interesting discussion to have.
Artificial general intelligence is probably this creative AI that we're talking about. Do you think we're going to get there eventually?
Well, there have been naysayers all along, and I've never really believed the naysayers. I think that there are probably no limits to what we'll be able to do as we develop, greater compute power and deeper theories in artificial intelligence. I think that the sky's the limit. So there are those who say that it will never create beautiful music and literature and so forth. I think that it will. I think that it will eventually be able to outpace humans in most activities. There'll still be the question of whether it's merely just a fantastic statistical analyzer, and there isn't an insight there. It's just statistical computing. But that raises the whole deeper question of what do we mean by creativity? And is creativity nothing but a fancy computation? And what is human creativity? So when a scientist makes a breakthrough, for example, or a musician, a composer makes, a Beethoven makes a breakthrough in some creative piece of music. What's going on there? In many cases, of course, you have to have done your homework. You have to have done, typically, very few of us can do genius work without having, put in some homework. Maybe a few composers, maybe Mozart. He apparently was composing as a child, so there may be some exceptions, but typically you have to do your homework. And then many creatives will say that after they've done all their homework and they've thought about a problem for a long time, or musical composition, whatever it is that they're doing that's creative, in many cases, you then go into complete silence. You let go of all your thought and you go into a completely different space. In many cases, that's where the creativity and the new ideas come from. So you have to do your homework and think deeply or practice deeply or whatever it might be. But then you have to let go, and the creative ideas come from an interior silence. And so that I don't have a model for right now. And I don't know if anybody has a model for. There is some interesting work on that. So I wouldn't say that there's what I'm talking about is completely new. Cognitive scientists know about this phenomenon that I'm talking about, and they're studying it. So I'm not trying to say that there's something new here that no one's thinking about. They are thinking about it, but I think all of our theories about, where these ideas come from when, we've sort of put everything aside and all of a sudden a creative idea comes up to us. Right now, our best ideas are still purely computational. There is a limit to computation. Just take the set of integers, say the positive, the integers greater than 0. So 1, 2, 3 up through infinity. Mm-hmm. If you ask how many functions are there from the integers to the integers, it turns out that there's an uncountable infinity of functions. So it's a bigger infinity than the counting infinity. So counting infinity is called A left 0. The next infinity is called A left 1. So there's more functions from the integer to the integers than there are integers. But if you ask how many of those functions are computable, Alan Turing showed, and others have shown, but Alan Turing showed that there's a countable infinity of Turing machines, and therefore a countable infinity of computable functions. And that means, in some sense, almost no function is computable. So if we're thinking about cognition, human cognition, only in terms of computation, then the burden of proof is on the person who wants to define intelligence and cognition in terms of pure computation, when almost no function is computable. Most functions are not. Now, this gets technical. Now, one can say, well, there may be some topology in which the computable functions are dense, in some sense that you can get as close as you want to a non-computable function with computable functions. And that's an interesting discussion to have. But still, that raises the question, what do we mean by intelligence? If we think about it only in terms of computation, well, then the person who proposes that needs to explain to us why we don't need all these other functions that are there, most of the functions which aren't computable. So right now, all these AIs are only using computable functions. Mm-hmm. Now, we get to quantum computers. I'll have to think about that. Maybe with quantum computation, we'll be able to to do something that's non-computable. I'm not sure on that story right now. But right now the ChatGPT is definitely doing computations, and it's definitely the case that computable functions are probability zero in the set of all functions. And so why are we restricting to a probability zero subset of functions when we're talking about intelligence? Maybe what intelligence really is transcends the computable functions. Maybe it goes even deeper than the uncountable infinity Aleph-1. There are higher infinities, Aleph-2, Aleph-3. There's the whole Cantor's hierarchy of infinities. My guess is we're down at Aleph-0, and there's all of Cantor's hierarchy above us. And as we explore that, which is not trivial, I think we'll get closer to what we should be thinking about in terms of true intelligence, but maybe even true intelligence transcends that. On the one hand, I mean, I love artificial intelligence. I mean, I started in the artificial intelligence lab at MIT in 1979. So I've been at it for more than 40 years, I guess. Yeah. Quite a few years. And I think that we've barely scratched the surface of what it can do. But on the other hand, I don't think we should be patting ourselves on the back too quickly yet, because there are these questions that I've just raised about the computability versus the set of all functions from the integers to the integers. And then what happens when you go to higher levels of the Cantor's hierarchy? Surely our notion of intelligence can't ignore all that complexity.
What about the debate about potential threats of it? Do you think it's overblown?
In a word, yes. I'm not terribly worried myself about AI posing an existential threat to us. Of course, there can be problems, and any technology can be. Cars cause problems, and they cause lots of deaths and so forth. So, I mean, but we don't view cars as an existential threat to us. We know that there are risks, and we have to be, sober and use our cars intelligently. My one concern I have in the current discussion is I don't want that a small set of companies get legal control over this and have it become criminalized for other people to develop artificial intelligence. I'm concerned that the current conversations might go that way. So I want everybody to, if there are going to be restrictions, I want it to apply to everybody equally, and the criminal possibilities, the criminal responsibility to everybody equally. There should be no exceptions, or we should have it be free. What I don't want is this to be a ladder up time for certain companies that already have the technology, and it's ladder up so no one else can get on board and compete with them. That I think is not what we want to go. The best breakthroughs come from places we don't expect. Some goat herder in Ethiopia who's a genius and doesn't have the technology, but gets a hold of a little laptop, could make a breakthrough that, so a professor here wouldn't have been able to make. We've got to make sure that if there's going to be rules, they apply without exception, even to the big companies, and there's no ladder up where everybody else gets left behind and is not given the tools to compete.
No, you make me more comfortable now, because I thought we're one step away to find out whether we're going to exist or not, but it seems like we're far away even from that discussion even. Okay, let's talk about humans. You've taught a course on face perception at University of Irvine, right? Yeah. Before we talk about face perception, I want to understand a little bit of human vision and vision in general. How does it work mechanically? How is it we able to view, if you use that word?
A standard answer to that would be to talk about the neuroscience of vision. And your eye has about 120, each eye has about 120 million photoreceptors. It's huge. It's like a 120 megapixel camera. And you have essentially, in general, 4 kinds of photoreceptors. There are what they call long, medium, and short wavelength photoreceptors, which are responsible for color perception. Those are called cones. And then there are rods, which are responsible for more black and white and nighttime vision. Each eye then does data compression. So your eye is actually a very sophisticated data processor. It has there's all this technology in your eye is compressing 120 million photoreceptors down to only 1 million, roughly 1 million axons go out the back of your eye in the optic nerve to go to the brain. So already it's 120 to 1 data compression in the eye. So the eye is this very, very sophisticated computational device. Then from there, it goes to the lateral nucleus of the thalamus, where it also goes to area V1, primary visual cortex, and other areas of the brain. There's what's called a dorsal and a ventral pathway in the brain for processing visual images. Roughly a third of your brain's cortex is involved in vision. I mean, a third of your highest processing power is devoted to vision, and so that and part of the reason is that this is a massive parallel input, right? You have 120 million photoreceptor inputs. That's a lot of parallel data that's got to be processed to give you a spatial appreciation of the world around you. So that's why a third of the brain's highest processing power is engaged in visual perception. And there is a part of the brain in the ventral pathway it's called the fusiform face area. Neurons in that area seem to be specialized for computing descriptions of faces to allow face recognition, the identity of a person. That's in the ventral path. And in the dorsal path, there's another area that the superior temporal sulcus area, where you're processing more the expressions of faces. And so you can have a dissociation, you can have a stroke. If you have a stroke in the fusiform face area, you end up with what's called prosopagnosia, where you see a person and you can't recognize their face. You can see that they're smiling, you can see but you can't tell who it is. And conversely, if you have a stroke in the superior temporal sulcus area, you might be able to recognize people's faces, but you can't see what their expressions are. So we have this distributed processing of faces, and it's different areas of the brain compute different parts of your understanding of a face.
What else is in the processing of face so interesting and so complicated that you have the whole course devoted to this? The
reason why I spent a whole class on face perception was that there's a lot to face recognition. So the neurobiology of it is I mean, I've given an overview, but there's a lot to it. Mm-hmm. And the implications are for the practical applications of it are quite extensive as well. So I've consulted for companies where I use our knowledge about face perception to help them build advertising that will grab your attention. So I mean, it turns out that our attentional system has a hierarchy of things that it's looking for. And one of the things it's looking for is animate objects. Animate objects get more attention than inanimate objects for obvious reasons, right? But we're programmed. This is subconscious. This is wired into us to look for animate objects over inanimate objects. We're really wired to pay attention to eyes. If there's something that looks like an eye in your visual field, that goes pretty high up there in your priority of where you're going to look next. And so understanding that and understanding that face, so animate objects in general, faces in particular, and eyes especially, grab attention, you can see that you can now start to create visual advertisements and in ways that you can grab people's attention and pull their attention around any way you want to, and you can do it subtly. People might not even know what you're doing. So I've consulted for a lot of companies. We use this knowledge to direct your attention where we want it to and away from the competitors' stuff and so forth. So once you understand, so faces are really important. It's just interesting pure science, but companies are interested because understanding that and its role in the attentional system helps you, because what do you want as a company? You want attention to your stuff and attention away from the competitor. So it's all about grabbing and holding attention. If you know the neuroscience of face perception and attention and how faces grab attention and eyes grab attention and so forth. And then you learn that you can give abstract visual cues for eyes that might not be, when you first look at it, you might not say it looks like an eye, but it's tapping in to the attentional system so that you can disguise what you're doing. So it gets arbitrarily complicated. So the cognitive neuroscience, right? If you want to say something's dangerous, look, we're using it to manipulate people, right? And people have no idea that what we're doing, and companies pay good money to use that. So
that focus on eyes, it's evolutionary, right? It's probably because of predators that we recognize, right?
Yeah, I think the evolutionary biology is a very incredibly strong framework for understanding this and for making predictions. In fact, I have used evolutionary theory to make predictions about features of eyes that will make them more attractive. Because, so for example, you can attract good attention and bad attention. You can attract attention with a good emotion or attention with a bad emotion, right? So if I show you some horrible monster face, yeah, you got attention there, but maybe you don't want that feeling associated with your product. So I used evolutionary theory, for example, to predict that there's something called, there's this feature of the eye called the limbal ring. So your eye has a white part and a colored part. And for many people, it's harder to see if you have really, really dark irises, if they're really dark brown, or then it's hard to see this. But for lighter brown and blue and hazel eyes, you can see that in many cases there's a little ring right at the border where the white meets the iris. And I noticed a couple decades ago that in looking at children baby pictures, I noticed that the limbal ring was much more pronounced in infants in general than adults. And so I had my graduate students and undergraduate students actually look at this. We got hundreds and hundreds of images of people at different ages, and we measured the proportion of the eye that was in the limbal ring. And what I sort of casually observed, we got data showing that as you age, the limbal ring gets less pronounced and thinner in general. Of course, there are exceptions. So it's a statistical indicator of youth and also of health, because if you have cloudy eye, for example, then you might not be able to see the limbal ring. So if you can see a clear limbal ring, that means your eye is not cloudy. It means that's a sign of health. And if it's larger, that's a sign of youth. And so that generally, at least in male assessments of female attractiveness, youth is important. It's less important, but important for female ratings of male attractiveness. Females will tolerate a slightly older in males in terms of attractiveness. The bias is a little bit wider. If you're going to put an eye on an advertisement, if you want something that's attractive and says youth and health, then you can put a slightly more pronounced limbal ring. We did an experiment in my lab. It was very, very simple. We would show a subject, we'd say, we're going to show you two faces, and you have to say which is the most attractive face. And what we do was put up the same face, two copies of the same face. And we didn't tell the people what we'd done. Of course, we just said, pick one that's the most attractive. In one, we just left the eyes alone. The other one, we enhanced the limbal ring just a little bit. And the subjects would look at it, our display, and go, you're asking me to do something that's silly. The faces are the same. And we'd say, go with your gut, just choose. And well above chance, they would pick the one with the bigger limbal ring. So again, you don't even know why you're doing it. You just do it. And that's why understanding the features of the eye that lead to attractiveness can be used in advertising, and people don't even know what's happening to them. And so I'm just telling you that this is happening to you. I'm partly responsible, not solely, but partly responsible.
I blame you. One thing in the syllables I found very interesting, and I'm going to quote. So that there's in the end, they have to have a paper, right? It says, the paper should present either a new theory of some aspect of face processing or new experiment with a detailed design. So is it that easy to come up with new theory?
It's not. And I threw that out there just in case there was some Einstein in the class to do it. And in general, I just got new experiments. For undergrad class, I wouldn't expect it. I mean, I'd be delighted and happily surprised. For them, I was expecting, a good new experiment. For a graduate class, I would hope for maybe some new insight. For example, I mentioned the limbal ring. It turns out that looking at infant eyes, they're slightly bluer The white is slightly bluer than adults, and as we age, it gets a slight yellowish. And certain diseases, certain illnesses also cause a yellowing of the white. So another obvious theory about attractiveness in eyes is that you could take, for example, someone's picture, a photograph of their face, and just go into the white of the eye and make it slightly bluer, just subtly bluer, especially if, for example, if it's a woman, that should make them more attractive because it's a signal of youth.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you took the same woman's eye or a man's eye and make it slightly yellower, you could make them look maybe perhaps less attractive because that's a sign of statistically. Again, these are all statistical correlations, but evolution wires us to respect them. Statistically, yellower means older and perhaps less healthy. And again, male ratings of female attractiveness and female ratings of male attractiveness vary slightly. The selection pressures are different because the age range in which females can reproduce is a narrower range than for males, and so that's built in to the evolutionary modules for attractiveness. That's just the way we're wired. Now, of course, the fact that we're wired that way doesn't mean that we shouldn't also have knowledge at a different level and social, socially appropriate behaviors and so forth. So I'm just talking about what's given to us evolutionarily in terms of attractiveness. We're also given, triggers for being angry and fighting. We have to be careful, right? We just because that's part of evolution doesn't mean we get to, just do whatever we want to with it. So it's in that spirit that I'm talking, we have to frankly talk about what we think from evolutionary theory are the programs that are wired into us without blinking. We have to look at them, and then we can ask how we want to behave in response.
I've read your book, The Case Against Reality, which is mind-blowing. I enjoyed it. And as I was reading it and as I was watching the interviews of you talking about the book, kind of reminded me one of my favorite songs of Losing My Religion by R.E.M. And here is how. So I really like this song. When I hear it, I sing alone. I'm excited. I know the lyrics, but I don't really understand the meaning of the song, or I miss a lot of things. When I'm reading your book, I love the book. I think I understand it, but if somebody asks me to explain it to them, I was stuck like after the first sentence. So I wanted to dig in a little bit, because most of the time when you speaking to somebody, it's scientists, and a lot of things just go over my head, I guess. So let's just start from the some terms that you use quite a bit in the book, and we kind of touched on them a little bit already. So let's start with theory of evolution, right? Like, how should we think of theory of evolution to understand the case against reality?
My view about the theory of evolution by natural selection is that it has no serious rivals right now in understanding biology. It's an incredibly well-developed theory, and it's got a mathematical framework now, evolutionary game theory. And so anybody who wants to seriously understand our biology and our human nature, the best tool we have right now is evolution by natural selection and its instantiation in terms of like evolutionary game theory, evolutionary graph theory, and so forth. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that evolution by natural selection is the final word. I'm saying it's the best word we've got so far. Of course, it's up to scientists to try to probe and find the weaknesses in the theory and eventually come up with a new theory, right? That's deeper. But we have no such theory right now. So anybody who is studying human nature, for example, and the evolution of human perception and social norms and so forth, who ignores evolution is really not in the game. I mean, if you propose some new theory, you're going to have to explain to a scientist first that you understand evolution by natural selection. If you don't understand evolution by natural selection, no one's going to listen to you. No scientist is going to listen to you. That's right. You have to know that theory and know its limits, and then be smart enough to have a new theory that transcends those limits but gives you back evolution by natural selection as a special case. A tall order. And so, but a crank who says, "Oh, evolution is just wrong and I've got my own theory," is not going to get any attention from serious scientists. It's not that we think that we have the final word in evolution. I don't think it is the final word, but it's an incredible achievement. And any better theory has to account for everything that evolution by natural selection can account for and more. So it's in that spirit that I use evolutionary theory, for example, in my book. So to be very, very clear, I am not doctrinaire in saying that evolution by natural selection is the final truth. Absolutely not. It is absolutely the best theory that we have right now. And any scientist in this area would be irresponsible, first, not to know it, and second, not to use it. Of course, it's the goal of this, the responsibility and goal of scientists to eventually poke holes and transcend, get a deeper theory. But you don't transcend until you fully master the theory that we've got and fully understand it. A guy with a pair of binoculars is not going to beat someone who's got the Webb Space Telescope. You're just not going to do it, right? So you've got to first master evolution by natural selection, really know it inside and out, know its strengths before you can really know its weaknesses, and then be in a position to move forward. So it's in that spirit that. So not a doctrinaire spirit that I spend a lot of time in my book on evolution by natural selection, because that's where our current science is. A century and a half ago, if I was talking physics, I would be talking Newton, not Einstein, right? Why? Because Newton is the final word? No, Newton is not the final word. But it was the word that we had then. And it took a genius like Einstein to give us a new word. Einstein knew Newton, but he found the key weaknesses and moved on. So that's what's going to be required for us to move beyond. So I spend a lot of the book really helping readers to understand at the top level how evolution by natural selection works. But ultimately, I use it to suggest that we need a deeper theory. So I should talk about that approach. So evolution by natural selection, as Darwin first framed it, is about organisms, physical objects in space and time, competing for resources, which are physical entities, like apples and water and things like that. Physical resources in space and time, and mating. So it's all, objects in space and time. And I use evolution by natural selection to ask a technical question, right? The question is, what is the probability that evolution by natural selection would shape our senses, vision, touch, hearing, taste, smell, to tell us truths about objective reality, whatever objective reality might be? So that question is assuming that there is some notion of objective reality that's coherent. And the question is, would evolution shapes our sensory systems, right? That's what the theory tells it. Our sensory systems are being shaped to keep us alive. They're being shaped to, as we would say in evolutionary theory, we're being shaped by our sensory systems to guide adaptive behavior. So senses tell you what you need to do to stay alive long enough to reproduce. That's what adaptive behavior is. It's very, very clear to everybody who understands evolutionary theory that absolutely evolution shapes sensory systems to guide adaptive behavior. But my question was different. As sensory systems are shaped to guide adaptive behavior, are they also, in addition, shaped to show us truths about objective reality? And those are very, very different things. Truth versus just doing what you need to do to stay alive are very, very different things. So most of my colleagues just assume that, of course, we don't see all of reality as it is, and sometimes there are illusions, but in the general normal case, the intuition is that, I see a tree, that's because there really is a tree. I see the moon, that's because the moon really does exist. I see an apple, that's because in objective reality, there really is an apple or a bunch of atoms that are approximately modeled by what we call an apple. But there's no reason to hand wave. I asked a technical question. What is the probability? So this is a completely mathematically precise technical question. What is the probability that evolution by natural selection would shape any sensory system to see any features of objective reality, any properties of objective reality? Clean technical question. And you might be surprised that, evolutionary game theory has the tools to answer that. And the answer is surprising to most of my colleagues. The answer is the probability is zero.
Zero.
Probability is zero. We can go into the reason for why it's probably zero, but let me just say a two directions of pushback that I've gotten. And so one is from philosophers, a PhD thesis and in philosophical journals. I've taken some hits. So the argument is, my argument is self-refuting. I've shot myself in the foot logically. And the argument goes like this. Evolution, as Darwin was talking about it, assumes that there are physical objects like organisms competing for physical things like resources and killing each other. Now, Hoffman is using evolutionary game theory to claim that our perceptions of space and time and physical objects are not correct, right? To call into question physical objects as fundamental reality. So here's Hoffman's dilemma, and they'll say that I've put myself into an unfortunate dialectical situation. Is the way they'd like to put it. And my unfortunate dialectical situation is that either evolutionary game theory faithfully reflects Darwin's ideas about physical objects, organisms competing and so forth, or it doesn't. Now, if evolutionary game theory doesn't faithfully reflect Darwin's ideas, then I couldn't use it to show that Darwin's ideas that about objects being real is false. So I couldn't use it to say that when we see objects, we're not seeing the truth. And if it does reflect Darwin's ideas, then we couldn't possibly use it to refute Darwin's ideas. So in either case, Hoffman shot himself in the foot, and he couldn't possibly be doing what he's doing. Okay, so that's the argument for I couldn't possibly use evolutionary game theory to show that our perceptions of like physical objects, like organisms and resources, is mistaken, because the theory itself assumes those. Darwin's theory assumes those. So if the mathematics says that that's not right, either the mathematics doesn't reflect Darwin, in which case the mathematics is wrong, or the mathematics does reflect Darwin, and it couldn't possibly lead to the conclusion that the fundamental assumptions of the theory were wrong, because it's the mathematics. That's the argument. And that argument completely misunderstands two things. Number one, the nature of scientific theories, and number two, the nature of scientific progress. So the first thing to know about scientific theories is that every scientific theory has assumptions at the foundation. Every theory makes certain assumptions. Those assumptions are not explained by the theory. They're miracles. Those are the things, they are the miracles that the theory assumes. If you grant me these, then I can explain all this other stuff. Like Einstein, grant me that the speed of light is the same for all observers and all reference frames. Grant me that. And grant me that the laws of physics are the same for all inertial observers. If you grant him that, then he gives you this whole edifice. But why those two? He can't explain those. He's assuming those two assumptions. So now you can say, well, I can get you a deeper scientific theory. I'll give you a deeper scientific theory which explains those assumptions. So those are no longer assumptions. Those are things I explain. But your new theory will have its own new assumptions, which are its own new miracles. So there is, the bottom line is, first thing to know about science is every theory in science has assumptions at the foundation, which are miracles for that theory. And this cannot be removed. So there is no theory of everything. That's the first thing to know about scientific theories. The second thing to know is how we evolve our theories. You want to find out, given these assumptions, what are the limits of those assumptions? In other words, what are the limits of my theory? And so one reason we do mathematics, like use evolutionary game theory to formalize Darwin's intuition. So Darwin didn't use mathematics, right? I mean, his wasn't, he may have used statistics and so forth, but I'm talking about a mathematical model that is a formalization of the theory. Darwin didn't have that. That took quite a few decades. John Maynard Smith in the 1970s really launched that. One point, not the only point, but one point of giving a formal mathematical treatment of a theory is to find out the limits of those assumptions. Where do those assumptions finally give up? Where do they fall apart? And the reason why scientists are interested in that is because that then points the way to the next step. What's the deeper theory that we can come up with that will transcend it? So the whole point is to get mathematical theories And if you're lucky, they're going to be precise enough to come back and tell you the limits of the assumptions that were at the foundation of the theory. And so I'll give just a concrete example of this in physics today. The big theories in physics are, Einstein's theory of spacetime, special and general relativity, and quantum field theory. And of course, Einstein's theories assume spacetime is fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
That's his intuition, and that's what he's trying to formalize. Quantum field theory, the fields are defined over spacetime. So quantum field theory, assumes spacetime, in fact, relativistic, special relativistic spacetime. Those mathematical theories, so special general relativity and quantum field theory, beautiful and powerful mathematical theories. And they're so rigorous that they come back and tell us that spacetime cannot be fundamental. Now, those are theories that were built on the assumption that spacetime is fundamental, okay? That was Einstein's idea. Spacetime is fundamental.
And spacetime, it's basically an assumption that there is this physical space and there is time.
And there is time. That's right. Our theories, those physics theories tell us that spacetime stops making sense at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, roughly. So it tells us where it stops. Spacetime is great until you get to 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Then it has no operational meaning. And time is great until you get to 10 to the minus 43 seconds. And then it has no operational meaning. So I can use the philosopher's argument and say, so the philosopher's argument now would be this: absolutely not. You can't show that space-time isn't fundamental without refuting yourself, right? Einstein's notion is that space and time are fundamental. Now, either special and general relativity and quantum field theory faithfully represent Einstein's idea that space-time is fundamental, or they don't. If they don't, then they couldn't possibly refute space-time. And if they do represent his idea, then they would never contradict space-time. Well, and then you say, well, so the physicists are in this unfortunate dialectical situation. And the answer is no, you completely misunderstand the nature of scientific theories and the way that scientists move from one theory to the other. We're looking for the limits of our assumptions. And if our mathematical formulation is good enough, it will tell us precisely when those assumptions fail, like 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, it's over. And so that's how science progresses. In some sense, we're pulling ourselves up by the bootstrap by saying, here's our current theory with its assumptions. We'll make it mathematically precise. Then we find out, okay, here's the limit of our assumptions, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. It's all over for space-time. Okay, what can we do next? How do we go beyond space-time? And in the last 10 years, physicists are doing that. They're going entirely outside space-time. They're finding structures like the amplituhedron and cosmological polytopes and decorated permutations. The goal, though, is to show that these bigger structures outside of space-time project down as special cases into space-time and give us back Einstein and quantum field theory as special cases of a more general theory. And this is how science progresses. And so my work in evolution is in that spirit. I use evolutionary game theory to show the probability is zero that our perceptions of objects in space and time is objective reality. It's precisely zero that our perceptions, according to evolution, would be accurate. And so that means that the very foundational concepts of evolution, that there are physical organisms looking for physical resources, is only an approximation to a deeper theory in which, space and time themselves are not even fundamental. And what's interesting here is what I'm saying from evolution by natural selection, evolutionary game theory, precisely matches what the physicists are saying, namely, space-time is doomed. It cannot be fundamental. So our best theories, evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory with gravity, are both telling us, the mathematics is telling us, it's time for science to go beyond space-time and look for a deeper theory. The deeper theory has to project back into space-time and give us Einstein, quantum field theory, and evolution by natural selection as projections of the deeper theory.
It's not all the scientists who think that space-time is doomed. It's just a subsegment, right?
Right. So it's the high energy physicists. So these are the physicists who are dealing with physics at the smallest scales, sub-proton scales. So looking at the level of quarks and gluons. So the Large Hadron Collider kinds of experiments where they're looking inside the proton, electron-ion collider kinds of things, where your energies are so high that you actually destroy the proton and look inside and see the quarks and gluons. And so most physicists are not high energy physicists. High energy physics is a small subfield of all of physics. And when I talk with physicists, I mean, I've been to conferences on consciousness where there are quantum theorists. So these are physicists with PhDs in quantum theory. And I'll ask them what they think about the high energy physics stuff about space-time is doomed and the new structures like the decorated permutations beyond space-time. And they've never even heard of it yet. But the first paper on the amplituhedron came out in 2014. It was published in 2014. So it's 9 years ago. So no surprise. I mean, and no surprise in another sense. In 1905, when Einstein published he had his miracle year and he published several papers, one on special relativity, one on the photoelectric effect, and so forth. That was it for Newton. Newton was gone. Newton, I mean, as the fundamental theory, of course, Newton is still used. It's powerful. We use it for, sending rockets into space and so forth. It's powerful theory. But in terms as a fundamental theory, it was over for Newton. Space-time, as Newton thought about space and time, was over. But in 1922, when Einstein was awarded his Nobel Prize, the Nobel Committee made it very, very clear that it was not for his theories of space, his theory of space-time, general or special relativity. They frankly didn't believe it. And by the way, these are smart people, right? I mean, these are the Nobel Committee people that know their science. So it takes a while for the rest of the field to catch up, partly because there's inertia, right? Newton had reigned for several centuries. Some upstart German scientist is not going to overthrow it overnight without a fight, and so it took a long time for the ideas people to really grasp, oh wow, okay, it really is over for Newton. And so space and time has such a grip on the human imagination. It's no surprise that it's going to take a long time for scientists to really come to grips with the fact that space-time is simply a data structure. And from my view, and this is now my take on it, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters is pretty shallow. It's not 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters. It's just 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and that thing falls apart. So, I mean, my view is, from an evolutionary point of view, if we evolve space-time as sort of our user interface for dealing with reality, we got a cheap model. We got shortchanged here. We only see in 3 dimensions. The thing falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. Why couldn't we see in 20 dimensions or 1,000 dimensions and have 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters?
Like, what does it even mean? I can't comprehend something like, what is that 1,000 dimensions? Like, what does it mean from the perspective of regular humans who are not scientists and who don't know math?
That's a great question, and it really brings out my point, which is we're shortchanged. We're so deeply shortchanged that we can't even imagine outside of this tiny little box that we're stuck in. 3 dimensions is all we can even imagine. So we were cheated, deeply cheated with our cheap space-time. But I'll just give you an idea how to think beyond it. So, for example, how could we possibly talk about the volume of a 10-dimensional object? What does that even mean to talk about the volume of a 10-dimensional object? Well, let's work our way up, because we can use our interface and then transcend our interface. So take a square with the sides are each 1 inch, right? So it's a square and each side is 1 inch. Well, then the area of that is, we'll put it this way, it's 2 inches. So it's 2 inches on a side. So what's the area of that square? Well, it's 2 times 4, which is 4. So now let's do a cube. Each side is 2 inches on the cube. Now it's 2 times 2 times 2, which is it's going to be 8 cubic inches. So now use the mathematics to another dimension. So now we go to a 4-dimensional thing. So it'll have, instead of 3 axes, it'll have 4. And the volume will be 2 times, so it'll be 2 to the 4th, which is, 16. It'll be 16 4-dimensional cubic inches. And so as you go to higher and higher dimensions n, it'll be 2 to the n dimensional volume that you get in that. So it's very easy for us mathematically to recognize, okay, here's the trend that we see inside spacetime where we can actually visualize it, but we can see that this extends to arbitrary dimensions. We could do this to a trillion dimensions. And we know there's 2 to the volume is 2 to the trillion. And so that would be, and so any question that you want to ask, we can answer it in those larger dimensions. The frustration we have is we can't visualize it. And that's where we got cheated. That's why I call this, we got the cheap headset, the cheap, yeah. And I can imagine organisms that aren't stuck with the cheap one that we got.
Do you think other species like on Earth are not cheated? Do you think they might see more than we see?
Yes. We have evidence for it, for example, in color vision. I believe the pigeon has 4 color receptors. We only have 3. And the mantis shrimp has more than 10.
How does it translate into the humans? Like, well, if we had 4 those color
photoreceptors,
yeah, what would we see?
Well, it turns out there's evidence that there are some women that do.
Women.
They're called tetrafems, and so it turns out that the gene for the red cone photoreceptor is on the X chromosome. Men only get 1 by definition, but in general, there are anomalies, but in general, men only have 1 X chromosome, and women have 2. So men only get 1 shot at getting the red cone photoreceptor right, and that's why more men than women are actually red-green colorblind. But so less women are red-green colorblind because they have 2 X chromosomes, and so 2 shots at getting this red cone photoreceptor. They differ slightly in their peak sensitivity. It's just a few nanometers, just a few billionths of a meter, but they're different. And it turns out in some women, a friend of mine who's a researcher here at UC Irvine, Kimberly Jameson, Dr. Jameson, has been one of the people who's done a lot of research on this. There seem to be some women that have 1 version of the red cone photoreceptor on 1 X chromosome and the other in the other X chromosome. And she has evidence that both are expressed in the eye, and so that there are actually 4 different kinds of cone types in the retina of these women. And when she does careful experiments, she actually gets evidence that they actually see a richer world of colors. They can make finer descriptions of distinctions between colors than most women and all men. No. So these women, she calls them tetrafems. They apparently are living in a color world that you and I can't even imagine. Right? If I ask you, imagine a color that you've never seen before.
Yeah, I can't.
Nothing happens.
Yeah.
That is the limit of your interface. You've been shortchanged by evolution. You've only got 3 cone photoreceptors. That limits, you can't even think concretely about a new dimension of color. And these women are living in that dimension of color. They're living in it, and you and I can't even think about it.
But do they see different colors, new colors, or they just see different shades of the colors we see?
The evidence seems to be that they're actually seeing something new.
Really? Wow.
So it's not just 1 new color, but it's a new dimension of color, a whole new dimension of color.
Interesting. Okay.
And who knows, the mantis shrimp has more than 10. I've forgotten, it's like 11 or 12 or something like that. I've forgotten exactly how many the mantis shrimp has. But could the mantis shrimp be living in a 10 or 10 plus dimensional color space? Who knows? But pigeons, I believe, have 4, and there are other animals that can see. For example, bees see in, I think, ultraviolet. We don't see in ultraviolet.
Yeah, we don't.
So they're actually seeing light that we can't even see. The lowly bee can see light that we don't see. So once again, we tend to take our little restricted, tiny little headset, our perceptions of color and space and time, as the fundamental reality. And that's, from my book, a rookie mistake. It's just a rookie mistake that we take our perceptions as the measure of all things. We get hints in biology that there are animals that see infrared. that we can't see, ultraviolet that we can't see, that have more color receptors than that, some that can actually perceive electric fields and magnetic fields and the polarization of light. Some evidence that some birds actually can see the polarization of light. So they live in worlds that you and I literally cannot concretely imagine.
Based on your theory, not theory, your book, it's by design. The reason why we don't see it is because it's overly complex and it actually can be counterproductive. Is it fair?
Yeah, the way I put that, you're right, but I would put it slightly differently. I would say that there are selection pressures to keep things as simple as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, complexity evolves if competition requires it, right? If your neighbor gets an ability that requires you to be more complex to deal with it, then you might have to be more complex to deal with it. This is, again, an evolutionary argument. So when I say it again, I'm not being doctrinaire. I'm just saying, on the assumption of evolutionary theory, that's the kind of answer. I've already said that I think there's a deeper story to be had, and evolutionary theory is not the final word, but it's the best word we've got. So yeah, there's selection pressures to do things as cheaply as possible, because the more complicated the neural circuitry is, the more calories it's going to consume, right? And the more calories it consumes, that means you're going to have to spend more time going out, killing things and eating them to get those calories, and that's putting yourself at risk. So that's what there are selection pressures to do things on the cheap. Our color perception is interesting. There is some evidence that some of our ancestors may have had better color vision than we. We got forced to be sort of nocturnal during the dinosaurs. And so we lost, there's some evidence that we lost some color vision. And after the extinction of the dinosaurs, we were able to emerge and back into, daylight vision. And so we're now slowly evolving, getting more color receptors back. So, but our vision systems seem to be perhaps in some ways inferior to avian bird vision systems.
Yeah. And by the way, regular people, let's say you and I, do we see the words the same way in terms of colors? Or when we look at the color of red, we both have my slightly different shade of it?
We know that roughly 2/3 of men have one of the alleles of the red cone photoreceptor gene, and 1/3 have so it's 2/3, 1/3. So in careful tests, you can show that the men make slightly different color matches. So yes, the chances are that we know that 2/3 of the men see the red, orange, yellow part of the spectrum differently than the other 1/3. So absolutely.
But it's not like individual. Every single person has different.
That's right, and we also differ in the higher brain processing. So I mean, once we get, I've just been talking about the retina, the photoreceptors in the retina. There's billions of neurons in the brain that are also involved in the processing of the visual images. And those are going to vary even more from person to person. So we have big differences in ability with face perception, for example. It turns out that there's something that I mentioned, prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces. But that doesn't just happen with stroke. There are some people who are born with prosopagnosia, and then there's all sorts of variants between someone who's really good at face recognition, poor until you can't. So there's a whole gradient there. And so in all of our visual abilities, there are going to be gradients. Different people are going to have different strengths and different weaknesses. So effectively, we're all variants on one basic theme. We have 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, roughly 3 dimensions of color. It's all roughly the same headset, but from an evolutionary point of view, we're not the final target. We're a product that's being evolved. And so the evolution is happening now. You're different from me because maybe what happened to you in terms of vision is better than what happened to me. And so you'll be more likely to survive and reproduce. And that new visual process will go on and mine will go extinct. So evolution isn't done. We're not the final product. Evolution predicts that we all differ in small ways, sometimes big ways. And it's those differences that are the engine of evolution to get a better, quote unquote, better, more adaptive visual system for the next generation.
Back to space-time. If space-time is doomed and there is a more complex theory evolve that. That basically means that we not necessarily have to be limited to speed of light, right? So we can explore the universe.
That's right. The speed of light is the law if you're inside space-time. Nothing can go through space and time faster than the speed of light. But we already know that there's one clean quote-unquote exception, and that is that space itself is not subject to that law, and space can expand faster than the speed of light. Huh. So space itself is expanding, and the rate of the expansion need not be less than the speed of light. So we already know that there's that quote-unquote violation of the speed of light. It's not a violation if you say Einstein's rule is nothing can go through space-time faster than the speed of light, then there's no violation within space-time. But space-time itself can expand faster than the speed. So there are objects that are receding from us faster than the speed of light, not because they're moving faster, but because space-time itself is expanding faster.
Your perception of the world from this lens, your personally, how has it changed your day-to-day life? Like, do you try to understand things from different angle? Did you adjust? Like at some point, I don't know, when this struck you that, hey, everything that I see is oversimplification. But I'm curious if you adjusted somehow.
It's a shock to the system for me, and I think for most, to seriously consider the possibility that almost everything that I've deeply believed since I was an infant is either deeply wrong or only a crude approximation. It's really a shock to the system. It's scary. Emotionally, it's scary to, and I see it when I've given talks, colloquia in conferences and so forth, and where I argue on evolutionary grounds that we don't see reality as it is, that space and time isn't fundamental. And I get the standard questions for 10 or 15 minutes where people know that they can trivially show that I'm wrong. And then I answer their questions. And after I've answered 5 or 6 questions, all of a sudden, then I start to see like fear. In many cases, like when people start to go, oh, shoot, I might have to take this seriously. And as soon as they realize that they can't just dismiss it out of hand, and they start to contemplate the possibility that they've been deeply wrong about something they believed fundamentally all their life, it's deeply unsettling. And it's been deeply unsettling to me. But it was deeply unsettling to realize that the earth is not flat. We got over it, but it was deeply unsettling. And it was deeply unsettling to get over the false belief that the earth is the center of the universe. Galileo was imprisoned over that. It was deeply unsettling, and people didn't want to believe it. And so but those are just warm-ups. It's even more deeply unsettling to contemplate the possibility that my very perceptions of space and time are not the truth. They're a poor man's cheap headset, an interface to a reality that transcends space and time. And we have evidence of other animals whose interface is superior to ours in many dimensions, but our science is telling us that space-time is not fundamental. And evolution is telling us it's basically just a user interface. It's there to guide adaptive behavior, period, not to show you the truth. And it's cheap because, as we talked about earlier, evolution tries to do things as cheaply as possible. We got a cheap model. And so our best theory tells us you're going to get a cheap model as cheap as possible. And from our point of view, we got shortchanged. My point of view.
I'm sure you spend a lot of time thinking about what's beyond that headset. Like if you take that headset off, what do you think is out there?
I'm thinking about that full time right now.
Yeah.
That's my current research project. And I'm paying very close attention to what the physicists are doing, because the physicists are the high energy physicists like Nimar Hamed and his collaborators. They found something called the amplitude-hedron, which is a geometric object. Think about it as like a monolith. This is a monolith beyond space-time.
Don't tell me it has trillion dimensions.
It could have trillions or more.
Jesus.
You can have trillions of dimensions, and it's beyond. These are not curled up inside space-time. So these are utterly and completely outside of space-time. So don't think about this as an object in space-time. It's entirely outside of space-time and prior to space-time, also prior to quantum theory. So the idea is that quantum theory is not fundamental either. Space-time and quantum theory are both mathematical theories that are stuck to our headset, but they're not deeply true beyond it.
Do they have to eventually merge those two or not necessarily?
Oh, well, what they have to do is show how space-time and quantum theory emerge together as projections of the deeper mathematics. So here's how far they've gotten. They've found structures like the amplituhedron, which is for massless particles like bosons, massless bosons. So like gluons, which are massless bosons typically inside of protons, but they can be outside. Gluons and photons. Those are the two massless particles. So the amplituhedron deals with gluons and photons, but now they've extended it. They've gotten deeper structures beyond the amplituhedron. And one of the deepest is something called the decorated permutations, which is, again, another mathematical structure. It's like permutations, like shuffling cards or permutations, right? Those are different permutations of the cards. Decorated permutations are slightly more complicated. If you're interested, we can talk about it. But so what I've been thinking is this. I've been working on consciousness, a theory of consciousness, which is an entirely different topic that we haven't talked about. But it's a big topic in cognitive neuroscience because my colleagues are trying to show how brain activity creates consciousness, or complex physical activity more generally, maybe an artificial intelligence with the right kind of circuit complexity you might think could create consciousness. That's the hope. Or so they're integrated information theory and other theories, orchestrated collapse of quantum microtubules. There are a bunch of theories about how physical systems could create consciousness. And all of them have failed so far to explain even one specific conscious experience, right? There's not a single specific conscious experience that they can say, this is the integrated information pattern that must be the taste of chocolate. It couldn't be the taste of vanilla. There's not a single one. So we're batting zero for any specific conscious experiences that we can explain. And from my point of view, no surprise, space-time isn't fundamental. It's just a headset. It's like trying to take the pixels of your headset and show that that's the fundamental reality and build stuff out of it. Well, good luck. The pixels are just pixels. Space-time is just your headset. Neurons are just images in your headset. They're not fundamental reality. So if I take consciousness seriously, you can say, consciousness is an illusion. And I have good friends and colleagues who say that. Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish say consciousness is just an illusion. Most of my colleagues and friends think that consciousness is not an illusion. When I have a headache, there is something real there. It's not an illusion. The color green, feeling of love, and so forth. So I've been working on a theory of consciousness outside of space-time because space-time isn't fundamental. So I got a mathematical theory. It's a Markovian dynamics, which is a kind of dynamical system. In one way simple, but it's quite general. And anyway, to answer your question, what I'm working on right now this year is that we found a way to project this Markovian dynamics onto the decorated permutations that the physicists have found. So we discovered this mapping. So our goal is to show that we have this dynamics of conscious agents, the Markovian dynamics, that projects through the decorated permutations into space-time. And I'm working right now to be able to predict scattering amplitudes for like gluon, 2 gluons scattering to 4 gluons out. Want to predict that from a theory of consciousness outside of space-time. And that would be then a first step out of our space-time headset into a dynamical reality outside of that. For sort of the scientists in the audience, they may have heard of hidden Markov models, right? There's something called hidden Markov models, where what you see are, the idea of a hidden Markov model is you might see something, but behind what you can see is a complicated world of Markovian dynamics beyond it, and you're just seeing the projection of that dynamics onto the things that you can see. And so you get what looks like a dynamics on what you can see, and you can get what looks like laws in what you see, but those aren't the real laws. The real laws are from this hidden Markov model that you can't see. It's a much deeper dynamics. And that's where I'm headed, is to say, effectively, there's a hidden Markov model for space-time. Once we get this deeper dynamics that I call conscious agents, but frankly, if someone doesn't like consciousness, you can just say there are these entities beyond space-time. They're dynamical entities beyond space-time that have Markovian dynamics, and it projects into space-time and will give us back the scattering amplitudes. That's what I'm working on now.
Is consciousness fundamental?
That's a great question. The way I would answer it is it's certainly more fundamental than space-time. So I'll be very explicit about what I mean by consciousness here. So I'll first just say things like experiences, the experience of colors, the experience of shapes, the experience of emotions. These I take as more fundamental than our concept of space-time. Space-time is just a particular organization of experiences, a fairly trivial one, frankly. The possibilities for the varieties of experiences and formats of experiences are unlimited, and space-time is just one of an infinite set of possibilities of organizations of experience. So space-time is not fundamental. It's just one trivial example. In that framework, conscious experiences are more fundamental than space-time. Space-time is merely one format of conscious experiences. But my attitude about science is that there is no theory of everything. So the reason I hesitate to say consciousness is fundamental is, as a scientist, I have to be completely open to the possibility that there's going to be some new set of assumptions that I haven't even thought about. I'm not smart enough or creative enough yet to think about, that will completely maybe we'll develop a theory of consciousness beyond space-time, but then we'll find a deeper theory that's even deeper than that. So I will just want to say consciousness is more fundamental than space-time, but it maybe is just the next baby step that science needs to take beyond space-time, and who knows what the next baby steps will be. My deep belief is that there's infinite exploration ahead. In principle, we will never get to a scientific theory where we can say this is the final theory. And these entities, the entities of this scientific theory, are the fundamental entities. So that's why I hesitated to say consciousness is fundamental. I'll say it's more fundamental than space-time for sure. But in principle, there's infinite job security in science, because we'll never get the final theory of everything.
Yeah, that's very complicated. Even here, every question I ask, there are like a million more questions that I can continue asking. And
the rabbit hole is very deep.
I can't imagine quantify those. One more question, if I may. We have our experiences, and a lot of times we see dreams at night based on those experiences. Your experiences, you think about consciousness and a lot of stuff that I don't think about. I'm wondering, what types of dreams do you see? Do you see anything related to what you study, and how do you perceive it?
No, I think that my dreams are probably not too different from an average person's dreams. If I'm really working on a hard problem, I might have a dream that relates to that problem, but often they're pedestrian things. You're dealing with the emotional issues that come up in your everyday life, your personal relationships, things that frustrated you in terms of things you wanted to get done and didn't. So a lot of it is working through it's unresolved emotional conflicts that you have to process and so forth. So I think I'm no different in that regard. But every once in a while, I get I'll wake up with creative insights, partly maybe through a dream, but often I just wake up and in the silence at night, ideas come. And that's one reason I was saying that often the creativity comes. You have to do your homework, you have to do your reading, you have to do your hard thinking, you have to study the scientific papers, but often the real breakthroughs come in the middle of the night when the mind is quiet. And maybe dreams, I mean, there are famous examples where this guy got the structure of some molecule by dreaming about a snake biting his tail or something like that, and it worked. I mean, it gave him the idea that he needed to work out some chemical structure. So yeah, that kind of thing happens to me, but I would say that most of my dreams are pedestrian, like everybody else's.
It's basically your dreams are within space-time.
Yes, which is really, really interesting. We have these tools. We're given the tool of mathematics. We have this wonderful tool of mathematics, which lets us work outside of space-time to go to as many dimensions as we want. But many times I find myself frustrated because I would like to just visualize it. And if I could just see this thing, I could make progress much more quickly. Because I can't see it in my mind's eye, I've got to write down this mathematics or go to a differential geometer or some kind of mathematician and work. and it's arduous work. Whereas in three dimensions, it's not. I can just see, I can visualize what's going to happen. In 4 dimensions, 20 dimensions. Now you're. So, for example, we're working on these polytopes, the so-called Markov polytopes, to describe this Markovian dynamics. The 4-dimensional the Markov polytope of 3 states involves is a, let's see, it's a very high dimension. It's a 9-dimensional space. It's a 6-dimensional object embedded in a 9-dimensional space. So I can't visualize the thing. So we published a paper on it, but it's like pulling teeth. Everything that you find out about this structure is not like I see it and I can just write it down. No, you've got to go theorem proof, and that's how we quote unquote see these structures, is by the arduous process of theorem and proof. Okay, we have to prove that this is the way this part of the structure is. And then, okay, I can't visualize it, but now I know that. Okay, I still can't visualize it, but I know that that's true. And so we have to I'm stuck even in my dreams to only visualizing the 3D, but to do the work in n dimensions is like pulling teeth, and you have to have that's where mathematics shines. That's the only way for us to crawl out there and do it. And so I work with mathematicians who are much more gifted than me, and we work on this together. Chetan Prakash and other Manish Singh, and I've got a physicist working with me, Shwapon Chatterjee, who's a brilliant physicist working with me, and a wonderful student, Ben Nepper, is working with me right now. So in each area, they're much sharper than me.
Well, Doctor, thanks very much for being on the podcast. I think I can talk to you like for 15 hours and I still will scratch the surface of whatever I ask you. That's fascinating. But thank you so much for your time. I could
work on this for 50,000 lifetimes and I still would have scratched the surface. So, but it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.